Imagine it's early 2026. The news is good. In fact, it's great. Senior officials are on television predicting an economic boom. Inflation has cooled to just 2.7%, the lowest in months. Your retirement account is climbing. Your job feels secure. Everything you see, everything you hear, tells you the American machine is humming. But it's a gilded cage. While the headlines celebrate, the government's own balance sheet tells a terrifying story. A $38 trillion national debt, now expanding faster than the entire U.S. economy can grow. This isn't just an accountant's problem. It's a hidden claim on everything you own and everything you will ever earn. The coming crisis is no longer a distant threat. Experts warn it's almost inevitable, and it was all engineered by a single, catastrophic policy trap. So how do we walk right into it? To understand how a nation arrives at a $38 trillion problem, you can't look at last year's budget. You have to rewind the tape. Not just a decade, but a century. The story of this debt isn't about one president or one party. It's about a fundamental change in how America deals with crisis. It starts with a panic. In 1907, New York's Knickerbocker Bank fails, and the system teeters on collapse. The response? A new institution, the Federal Reserve, created in 1913 with the power to manage the nation's money. Then came the Great Depression. After the crash of 1929, the government didn't just regulate, it spent, it built. It became the employer of last resort. Each crisis created a new, larger role for the government in the economy, a role that required money. For decades, this system seemed to work. The U.S. emerged from the post-war era as an industrial giant, and the debt, while present, was manageable. But a subtle shift was happening. A dangerous pattern was being set. We can call it the crisis ratchet. Every time a recession or a disaster hit, the government would ratchet up spending to solve it. But when the crisis passed, the spending never quite ratcheted back down. Each emergency left behind a higher baseline of debt. The tipping point arrived quietly. In 2013, the United States crossed a symbolic threshold. For the first time in modern history, the national debt officially surpassed 100% of the entire country's economic output. Both debt and GDP stood at roughly $16.7 trillion. Think about that. The country owed as much as it produced in a full year. By 2024, that ratio had already jumped to over 124%. The ratchet was clicking faster and faster. This wasn't a sudden accident. It was the result of 1,000 small decisions, a slow-motion pileup of good intentions and political necessities that accumulated over generations. Each step seemed reasonable at the time, but taken together, they steered the country onto a path that now seems almost impossible to leave. The policies of the past have become the trap of the present. So what does a $38 trillion debt actually mean for you? This isn't a distant problem for politicians in Washington. It's a direct threat to your wallet. If you break it down, that's over $115,000 of debt assigned to every man, woman, and child in the country. A shadow mortgage on your entire life. This isn't just a big number. It's a machine that actively makes you poorer. We've entered what you could call the growth inversion, the moment the national debt starts growing permanently faster than the national economy. Every dollar you save, every investment for your kids' future, is fighting a losing battle against a currency that is programmed to devalue. While officials promise a boom, the math tells a different story. Experts warn that some form of crisis is now almost inevitable. This is the silent risk underneath your 401k, your home's value, and your job security. How did we get here? What was the original sin that started this countdown to a crisis? To find the origin of this crisis, you don't look for a single explosion. You look for a quiet consensus, a slow creep that began in the final decades of the 20th century. The system that emerged was brutally simple, though never spoken aloud. One political party wanted to cut taxes. The other wanted to expand social programs. For generations, leaders faced a difficult choice between the two. But then, they realized they didn't have to choose. They could simply borrow the difference. This was the unspoken pact, the political engine of our debt. Let's call it the Perpetual Compromise. Both sides got their political wins. The bill? It was sent to the future. To you. This wasn't one president's mistake. It was a multi-decade relay race of red and blue. Each administration, from the Cold War to the War on Terror, took the baton of debt and ran their leg, adding trillions along the way. Congress, regardless of which party held the gavel, signed the ever larger checks. The Federal Reserve, the institution designed to ensure stability, was left to manage the consequences, to keep the economy from spinning out of control as the numbers swelled. Every crisis just accelerated the process. A recession? Stimulus. A war? Unfunded. A pandemic? Historic spending. Each emergency pushed the debt to a new plateau, a new normal from which it would never retreat. It was a one-way financial ratchet, always clicking forward, never back. What was once considered a shocking deficit became the new baseline for the next budget. But why? Why would generations of the smartest people in the room all make the same decision, over and over? Because this wasn't just a series of bad choices, it was a trap. A system with a hidden mechanism that made borrowing not just easy, but irresistible. The mechanism is deceptively simple. It doesn't involve complex derivatives or shadow banking. It's a quiet, relentless process that hides in plain sight, on page after page of the federal budget. I call it the deficit Doppler. It's the reason why the good news you hear about the economy, like an unemployment rate expected to settle near a healthy 4.2%, doesn't change the terrifying math underneath. Imagine the U.S. budget is a bathtub. The water flowing in from the faucet is tax revenue. The water going out the main drain is all government spending, military, roads, Social Security, everything. For decades, the drain has been wider than the faucet, creating a shortfall. To keep the tub from running dry, the government has been topping it up with buckets of borrowed water. That's the national debt. But here's the secret. There's a second faucet, a smaller one, installed years ago, that you can't turn off. This faucet drips interest on the debt. And with every bucket of borrowed water added to the tub, that interest faucet opens a little wider. A drip becomes a trickle. A trickle becomes a stream. The deficit Doppler works in 3 steps. First, the government spends more than it collects and borrows to cover the difference. Second, this new borrowing increases the total debt, which in turn increases the total interest payment required next year. This interest is non-negotiable. It's the first bill that gets paid. And here's the final, brutal step, the trap. Eventually, the interest payments become so large that they are a primary driver of the annual deficit itself. The government is forced to borrow new money just to pay the interest on its old money. The system is no longer funding services. It's funding itself, a snake eating its own tail. This isn't a political talking point. It's a mathematical process. And when you look at the raw numbers, you can see the exact moment the machine begins to accelerate towards its breaking point. The abstract theory of debt becomes brutally real when it claims its first victim. It wasn't a Wall Street bank or a failed hedge fund. It was a factory in America's heartland, a place that for 50 years had made high-precision gears for German automakers. Stable, well-paying jobs you could build a life on. Then, the floor fell out. The problem wasn't quality. The problem wasn't efficiency. The problem was trust. This is the first tangible effect of the policy trap, a mechanism I call the sovereignty squeeze. It's what happens when your allies and trading partners start treating you not as a leader, but as a liability. Think of it like your personal credit score. If you max out every card, your bank gets nervous. They stop offering you the best rates. Then they stop taking your calls altogether. For a country, the $38 trillion debt is the ultimate maxed out card. The evidence is right there in the open. While Washington was consumed by its own policy salad in January, the world was quietly moving on. European leaders, exhausted by the constant trade turmoil, started looking for more reliable partners. They found them. The European Union signed a new free trade agreement with South America. At the same time, Canada quietly cut a new deal with China. These aren't just headlines. They are financial shots across the bow. For that Ohio factory, the EU deal was a death sentence. Suddenly, a Brazilian competitor could supply the same gears, with no political drama and no risk of a sudden tariff. The German contract, worth tens of millions, evaporated. For a third-generation machinist named David, this wasn't an economic statistic. It was a foreclosure notice. It was the conversation he had to have with his daughter about her college fund. While officials talked about strong economic growth, David was packing his tools into a cardboard box for the last time. He and 300 others were the first to learn the devastating truth. When the government's credit runs out, yours is the one they come for. The factory wasn't the target. It was just the collateral damage. But this was just the beginning. So how does a country walk into a trap this large? It doesn't happen with a single bad decision. It happens through a quiet, relentless machine that runs in the background of American life. A machine I call the obligation engine. Here's how it works, step by step. First, a promise is made. It's always popular. A tax cut for families. A new benefit for seniors. A crucial defense project. Each promise, on its own, seems reasonable, even necessary. It solves a real problem for real people, and the price tag in any single year looks manageable. Second, the promise becomes permanent. What was once a new policy becomes an untouchable part of the federal budget. It gets a line item. An entire bureaucracy grows around it. To even suggest cutting it becomes political poison. It is no longer a choice. It is an obligation. Third, the obligations stack. The next year, new promises are made, and they stack on top of the old ones. And the year after that, more are added. The engine never stops running, and it only runs in one direction. Think of it like a subscription to a service you can never cancel, where the price automatically increases every single year, forever. This is why most people miss it. There is no single villain. There's no backroom deal. The engine is powered by 1,000 perfectly reasonable, popular decisions made over decades. The benefits are felt immediately. A check in the mail, a newly paved road. The true cost, however, is pushed into the future. The bill left for someone else to pay. But the final, most dangerous gear in this engine is interest. Eventually, the stack of obligations grows so large that the government has to borrow money just to pay the interest on the money it has already borrowed. This is the moment the trap springs shut. The debt is no longer just a result of spending. The debt itself becomes a primary driver of more spending. It begins to feed itself. The engine no longer needs politicians to add fuel. It runs on its own momentum, consuming the future to pay for the past. But what does this engine actually consume? How do these abstract steps translate into real dollars pulled from the economy? To understand that, you have to ignore the headlines and look at the raw accounting. The math reveals the true cost of these promises. The factory was a warning, a single ship taking on water. But the system didn't just continue sailing. It accelerated into the storm. The next casualty wasn't a relic of the industrial past. It was a vision of the future. A sprawling infrastructure project in the American Sunbelt, promised for a decade. High-speed rail, new ports, a digital backbone meant to create a new economic hub. It was sold as the ultimate investment. But the blueprints were drawn with the same poisoned ink. This time, the failure was not a slow decline. It was a sudden, catastrophic collapse. The project became a black hole for public funds, with costs ballooning year after year. The quiet machine that shuttered the factory was now operating on a national scale. I call this the progress paradox. The more a nation borrows to build its future, the more it guarantees that future will be one of perpetual debt service. The project didn't just fail to get built, it actively drained resources from everything around it. Schools, hospitals, and local businesses were starved of capital, all to feed a ghost train that would never run. While the media focused on political blame, the spreadsheet told a different story. The debt had become so large that the cost of borrowing money for the project simply outran any possible economic benefit. The lessons from the heartland were completely ignored. The pattern wasn't just repeating, it was amplifying. Think about the decades following the Civil War, from 1876 to 1900, when the United States emerged as an industrial giant, laying a foundation of steel and commerce. Now that same ambition was being crushed under the weight of its own financing. The trap was no longer just closing down the old America. It was preventing a new one from ever being born. This wasn't one factory's lights going out. This was the shadow of the debt eclipsing the sun for an entire region. And here's where it gets personal. The optimistic headlines are a distraction, a soothing story told while the real numbers are screaming a warning. To see the trap, you have to ignore the noise and do the math. It's a simple, brutal calculation I call the escape velocity problem. For an economy to be healthy, it must grow faster than the interest on its debt. It has to outrun its own shadow. For America, that race is already lost. Let's run the numbers. The debt is $38 trillion. Assume a conservative 3% average interest rate. The annual interest payment, not paying down the debt, just servicing it, is $1.14 trillion. Now, in a fantastic year, the U.S. economy might grow by $1 trillion. You see the problem. Every dollar of new growth, every bit of innovation and hard work, is consumed by interest payments. And we still have to borrow another $140 billion just to stand still. This isn't a slow motion problem, it's an accelerating crisis. In 2013, the entire national debt was $16.7 trillion. That means in just over a decade, we've added more than $21 trillion in new obligations. That's an average of $4.4 billion of new debt added to the books every single day. For 13 years. This isn't theory, it's arithmetic. The interest is now compounding faster than the economy that is supposed to pay for it. The system is no longer sustainable. It's a mathematical certainty. The engine has failed, and the ship is taking on water faster than we can bail. So the question is no longer if it breaks, but how. What does the end of a debt supercycle actually look like? There are only a few possible scenarios, and none of them are painless. But what about the good news? Skeptics will point to the headlines. They'll show you reports, like the one from just hours ago, showing third-quarter economic growth was revised slightly higher. They'll argue that a strong economy can simply outrun the debt, that this is a problem for another day, easily managed by growth and innovation. It's a comforting story, and it's the most dangerous one of all. The flaw in this argument isn't in the data they cite, it's in the data they ignore. The core of the trap has never been about whether the economy is growing. It's about whether it's growing fast enough. This is the great deception of our era, a concept we can call the growth mirage. You see the signs of prosperity, but you don't see the anchor of debt dragging underneath, pulling the entire system slower and slower. Think of it like a race. The U.S. economy is a powerful engine, no doubt. But the debt is its opponent, and it's getting faster every year. As one government watchdog recently warned, some form of crisis is now almost inevitable. Why? Because the debt is officially growing faster than the economy itself. For every new dollar of wealth America creates, it's taking on more than $1 of new federal obligations to do it. This is a treadmill to insolvency. The optimists are celebrating the speed of the runner, while ignoring the fact that the treadmill is accelerating even faster beneath their feet. They see a strong quarter, but the math of compounding interest on $38 trillion is relentless. It doesn't care about headlines. It just grinds forward. But even if they were right, so where does this road end? The future isn't a single destination. It's a branching path of probabilities, and we are approaching the fork. Let's call the first path, Scenario A, the slow grind. This is the future whispered about in quiet government reports. In this world, the consensus view holds. Inflation continues its gradual descent toward the 2% target. Unemployment settles, maybe around 4.2%. There is no sudden collapse, no dramatic headline. Instead, the $38 trillion weight simply grinds the economy down. The debt, now over 124% of the entire economic output, acts as a permanent brake. It's not a crash. It's a managed decline, a slow, quiet suffocation of opportunity that you feel every time you check your bank account. Then there is Scenario B, the sovereign shock. This is the future the raw numbers are pointing to. It doesn't start with a bang, it starts with a question. A question asked in Tokyo, in Beijing, in London. Is U.S. debt still the safest asset in the world? When the answer becomes maybe not, they demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk. This isn't a central bank decision. This is the market forcing America's hand. The government is then trapped, forced to print money just to pay the interest on its past borrowing. A crisis becomes, as one watchdog warned, almost inevitable. Which path is more likely? Every year that passes pushes us closer to the shock. Of course, a powerful group of skeptics insists this can never happen. They argue the United States is different, that it can carry any amount of debt because it prints the money the world needs. Now there's a powerful objection to all of this. A voice of reason that says, hold on. The United States isn't Argentina. It's not Greece. It prints the world's reserve currency. For half a century, America has written checks the rest of the world has been forced to cash. This isn't a bug. It's the central feature of the global financial system. So why should this time be any different? Why panic now when this exact argument has been wrong for decades? Because the math has changed. The old rules relied on one simple assumption, that the economy would always grow faster than the debt. For a long time, it did. But we have crossed a dangerous threshold, a point where the debt is now accelerating faster than the economy itself. Think of it like a rocket that's run out of fuel. Its upward momentum is gone. Now, there is only the brutal, downward pull of gravity. I call this the crossover point. It's the moment the problem becomes self-perpetuating. The interest payments alone begin to demand more money than vital public services. It's why one government watchdog recently warned that, quote, some form of crisis is almost inevitable. The system is no longer just bleeding. The wound is feeding itself. Every dollar printed to cover the old debt just makes the new debt heavier. The debate in Washington is about abstract percentages and 10-year budget windows. They treat it like a game on a spreadsheet. But that misses the point entirely. My focus isn't on the numbers, it's on the consequences. Because when a system this large fails, it doesn't fail neatly. So, you might be asking what I'm doing with my own money. Before I say another word, let me be absolutely clear. This is not financial advice. I am not your advisor. This is simply a look into my personal playbook, my own attempt to navigate the storm ahead. My strategy is what I call the barbell defense. It's built on specific triggers. My core position, about 80% of my capital, is in assets designed to weather a shock. But the other 20% is held in cash, waiting. I'm watching two numbers. First, the monthly consumer price index. If it prints above 0.3% for 2 consecutive months, that's a trigger. It tells me inflation isn't beaten. Second, unemployment. If it breaks decisively above 4.5%, that's my signal the real economic pain has begun. When those triggers hit, that cash gets deployed. This isn't about panic, it's about discipline. My position sizing is predetermined, designed to remove emotion from the equation. But here's the paradox. This defensive posture isn't just about surviving the fall. It's about preparing for the rebound. Because inside every crisis, buried under the fear and the headlines, is the seed of an incredible opportunity. A rally that most people will be too scared to see coming. The question is, what could possibly trigger it? We have walked the long road to this $38 trillion precipice. This isn't a partisan failure. It's a systems failure, a policy trap built over generations, designed for a world that no longer exists. The optimistic headlines you see are the bars of a gilded cage, meant to keep you comfortable while the foundations crack. But this story's final chapter is yet to be written. The math is brutal, but it isn't destiny. The most dangerous trap isn't the debt itself, but the belief that we are powerless to change course. Our next investigation exposes the escape routes, the politically toxic, radical ideas that might be the only way out. To follow that journey, a bell icon on this page will keep you informed. Because the system doesn't just want your money, it wants your attention.